Commander Sarah Chen adjusted her worn tactical vest for the 100th time as she stepped into the briefing room aboard the Galactic Defense Station Omega-7. The low murmur of alien voices immediately ceased, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that felt heavier than the artificial gravity generators. 23 pairs of eyes from 7 different species turned toward her, and she could practically taste the disdain in the recycled air. The Valorian delegation, with their crystalline blue skin and towering 8-foot frames, exchanged knowing glances. Their leader, Admiral Zethka, made no effort to hide his amusement, as his mandibles clicked in what Sarah had learned was their equivalent of suppressed laughter. The insectoid chitin representatives simply stared with their compound eyes, their antennae twitching in what she assumed was curiosity, or perhaps disgust. General Coraxus of the Draconian Empire didn't even bother looking up from his data pad, his scaled fingers drumming impatiently on the metal table. His dismissive attitude was nothing new. In the 3 months since humanity had been grudgingly accepted into the Galactic Defense Coalition, Sarah had grown accustomed to being treated like an unwelcome guest at a sophisticated dinner party. "Ah, the human has arrived," Admiral Zethka announced, his translator converting his melodic language into flat, mechanical standard galactic. "How quaint. I was beginning to think your species had forgotten about this meeting entirely." Sarah took her designated seat at the far end of the table, noting how it had been positioned to face everyone else, like a defendant before a tribunal. She pulled out her simple paper notebook, while every other delegate accessed holographic displays and neural interfaces. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "My apologies for the delay," Sarah replied evenly. "There was an issue with the transport shuttle that required my attention." "Of course there was," General Coraxus muttered, without looking up. "Primitive human technology failing again. Perhaps you should have walked here instead." A few delegates chuckled at the joke. Sarah maintained her composure, though her jaw tightened slightly. She had learned early in her career that rising to every taunt would only confirm their preconceptions about human instability and emotional volatility. Fleet Admiral Zenthos of the Aquatic Confederation finally called the meeting to order. His massive form shifted in the specially designed water-filled chair, causing small waves to lap at the transparent aluminum walls of his environment suit. "We are here to discuss the defense of the Kepler 442 system," he announced, his voice creating bubbles that his translator converted to sound. "Intelligence suggests the Void Swarm will arrive within 48 standard hours." The Void Swarm. Sarah had read every available report about them, though information was frustratingly scarce. An extragalactic threat that had already consumed 3 star systems in the Outer Rim, leaving nothing but dead space in their wake. No debris, no survivors, no explanation. They simply arrived, devoured everything, and moved on like a plague of cosmic locusts. "Our combined fleet stands ready," Admiral Zethka stated proudly. 47 Valorian dreadnoughts, each equipped with quantum disruptors and temporal shields. The pride of our military engineering. General Coraxus finally looked up from his datapad. "The Draconian Empire contributes 32 heavy cruisers armed with plasma cannons and reinforced with duranium armor plating. Our weapons have never failed to penetrate enemy defenses." Each species began listing their contributions with obvious pride. The Chitin offered their swarm fighters, thousands of small, agile craft that could overwhelm enemy point defenses through sheer numbers. The Ethereal Consortium promised their reality-bending technology, weapons that could phase enemy ships out of normal space-time. The list went on, each more impressive than the last. When the attention inevitably turned to Sarah, the room fell silent again. She could feel the weight of their expectations, or rather, their complete lack of expectations. "And what exactly does humanity bring to this coalition?" Admiral Zethka asked, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Besides enthusiasm." "Of course." Sarah straightened in her chair. "The Terran Defense Force will deploy 12 ships to the Kepler 442 system." The silence stretched uncomfortably long before someone actually laughed out loud. It was Commander Vextai of the Stellar Republic, a species known for their mathematical precision and logical thinking. Even they found humanity's contribution amusing. 12 ships? General Coraxus repeated slowly, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Against the Void Swarm? Are you planning to ram them with your primitive chemical rockets? Our ships may not be as advanced as yours, Sarah replied calmly, but they're reliable, and our crews are experienced. Experienced at what? Admiral Zethka challenged. Delivering cargo? Your species has been in space for what, barely 2 centuries? Most of us have individual crew members older than your entire space program. Fleet Admiral Zenthos raised a massive fin for silence. While humanity's contribution may be modest in scale, every ship matters. In a battle of this magnitude, the Void Swarm has proven resistant to conventional warfare tactics, which is precisely why we need advanced technology and proven strategies, General Coraxus interjected. Not whatever improvised nonsense the humans might attempt. Sarah felt a flash of anger but suppressed it. Instead, she opened her notebook and reviewed the tactical data she had compiled. If I may, I've been studying the previous encounters with the Void Swarm. There are some patterns that might be worth considering. The room erupted in barely contained amusement. Admiral Zethka's mandibles clicked rapidly. Their version of genuine laughter. Patterns? You've discovered something that the combined analytical power of 7 advanced civilizations missed? Please, enlighten us with your primitive insights. Sarah ignored the mockery and stood, moving to the large holographic display at the center of the table. With a few gestures, she called up the tactical data from the 3 previous Void Swarm attacks. The glowing representations of star systems appeared, showing fleet positions and the progression of each battle. The pattern isn't in their technology or their numbers, she began, her voice steady despite the hostile audience. It's in their behavior. Look at how they approach each system. She highlighted the attack vectors, showing how the Void Swarm had consistently approached from the same relative position each time, always targeting the largest concentration of defending ships first. They're not just randomly destructive, Sarah continued. They're systematic. They eliminate the biggest threat first, then work their way down. But more importantly, they seem to have difficulty adapting to unexpected tactics. General Coraxus scoffed. Unexpected tactics? What could possibly be unexpected about inferior technology? And 1. End quote. That's exactly my point, Sarah replied. They've only encountered advanced civilizations so far. Their tactics are built around countering quantum weapons, energy shields, and conventional fleet formations. But what if we don't follow conventional patterns? Admiral Zethka leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting the holographic light. Are you suggesting we adopt primitive tactics because they're primitive? 2. I'm suggesting we consider unconventional approaches, Sarah corrected. Sometimes, the simplest solutions are the ones nobody expects. Commander Vextai's logical mind seemed intrigued despite himself. Elaborate on these unconventional approaches, human. Sarah called up Earth's military history, showing various conflicts where inferior forces had defeated superior ones through asymmetric warfare. Throughout human history, we've faced technologically superior enemies. We've learned that victory doesn't always go to the side with the best weapons, but to the side that can adapt and improvise most effectively. Your primitive wars have no bearing on space combat, General Coraxus declared dismissively. This isn't about throwing rocks at armored knights, isn't it? Sarah challenged. The Void Swarm has superior technology, just like those armored knights, but they also have patterns, predictable behaviors. They rely on their technological advantages so completely that they've become rigid in their thinking. Fleet Admiral Zenthos bubbled thoughtfully in his environment suit. What specific tactics do you propose? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing this was where she would lose whatever small amount of credibility she might have gained. Hit-and-run attacks using kinetic projectiles. No energy signatures for them to track or counter. Unpredictable timing and locations. Make them react to us instead of following their predetermined patterns. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the laughter began. Admiral Exethka's mandibles clicked so rapidly they created a buzzing sound. Kinetic projectiles? What's next? Catapults? Perhaps we should throw rocks at them? You're talking about using museum pieces against the most advanced threat the galaxy has ever seen, General Coraxus added. This is exactly why humanity shouldn't have been admitted to the coalition in the first place. Sarah felt her cheeks burning but pressed on. The USS Constitution is over 300 years old and still in service because sometimes old, reliable technology is exactly what you need when everything else fails. The Constitution doesn't face planet-killing alien swarms, Commander Vextai pointed out logically. Your analogy is flawed. My analogy is perfect, Sarah shot back, her composure finally cracking slightly. Everyone in this room is so focused on having the newest, most advanced technology that you've forgotten the basics. Sometimes a sharp stick beats a plasma cannon if you use it right. Admiral Zethka stood to his full imposing height. This is precisely why your species is considered a joke among the galactic community. You consistently overestimate your abilities and underestimate the complexity of real warfare. Your 12 primitive ships will be vaporized within minutes of engagement. And then the real militaries will have to clean up the mess you've made. Sarah felt something snap inside her. All the months of condescension. All the barely veiled insults. All the times she had been excluded from important strategic discussions, simply because she was human. She stood as well, though at 5'6" she had to crane her neck to meet the Admiral's gaze. "You know what your problem is?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You're so concerned with looking sophisticated and advanced that you've forgotten how to actually fight. You've got all this incredible technology, but you use it the same way every single time, because that's what's considered proper by galactic standards." "How dare you?" Admiral Zethka began. "I'm not finished," Sarah interrupted, shocking the room into silence. "You want to know why the Void Swarm keeps winning? It's because they're fighting 7 different versions of the same enemy. None. You all have different technology, but you all think the same way. You follow the same tactical doctrines, the same strategic principles, the same civilized approach to warfare." She gestured toward the holographic display. "But humans? We've never been civilized. We've spent our entire history fighting dirty, thinking outside the box, and refusing to accept that superior technology automatically means victory. We've learned to win by being unpredictable, by breaking the rules everyone else follows." General Coraxus slammed his clawed hand on the table. "Enough of this nonsense. You're talking about chaos, not strategy. Sometimes chaos is exactly what you need," Sarah replied firmly. "The Void Swarm has adapted to counter organized, logical, civilized warfare. But they've never faced humanity before. They've never had to deal with an enemy that refuses to follow the established rules of engagement." Fleet Admiral Zenthos remained silent for a long moment, his large eyes studying Sarah intently. Finally, he spoke. "And if your unconventional tactics fail?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Then we'll fail. Fighting our way, not yours. But at least we'll learn something new about the enemy in the process. Information that might help the next battle." Admiral Zethka made a sound that didn't translate well. "This is madness. You're proposing to treat the galaxy's greatest threat like one of your primitive tribal conflicts. Maybe that's exactly what it needs," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe the galaxy's greatest threat requires the galaxy's most primitive solution." The meeting dissolved into arguments after that, with various delegates expressing their opinions about human arrogance, tactical stupidity, and the general inadvisability of allowing primitive species into advanced military alliances. Sarah sat through it all, making notes in her paper notebook, while advanced holographic displays flickered around her. When the meeting finally ended, she was the last to leave. As she gathered her simple materials, Fleet Admiral Zenthos approached her, his massive form creating small waves in his mobility tank. "Commander Chen," he said, his translated voice unusually thoughtful. Your proposals were unexpected. I'm sure they were, sir, Sarah replied, not looking up from her notebook. The fleet will deploy according to standard coalition doctrine, he continued. Your 12 ships will be assigned to perimeter patrol, well away from the main engagement zone. Sarah finally looked up. Of course they will. Wouldn't want the primitive humans getting in the way of real warfare. Perhaps, Zenthos said slowly. Sometimes getting in the way is exactly what's needed. Sarah studied his alien features, trying to read an expression she didn't fully understand. Sir? Deploy your ships as you see fit, Commander. Follow coalition doctrine, or don't. The choice is yours. With that cryptic statement, he glided away, leaving Sarah alone in the empty briefing room. She looked around at the advanced technology surrounding her, then down at her simple paper notebook. In 48 hours, they would face an enemy that had never been defeated, using tactics that had never failed. But the Void Swarm had also never faced humanity. Sarah closed her notebook and headed for the hangar bay. She had 12 ships and crews that were used to being underestimated. It was time to remind the galaxy why that was always a mistake. As she walked through the corridors of Omega-7, she passed groups of alien military personnel preparing for the upcoming battle. Their conversations stopped when she appeared, and she could hear the whispered comments about the primitive human and her laughable tactical proposals. Let them laugh, she thought. In her experience, the enemy that was laughed at was often the enemy that won. The USS Defiance waited in the hangar bay, a 300-meter frigate that looked primitive compared to the sleek alien vessels surrounding it. Her crew of 47 humans was running final systems checks. Their movements efficient, despite the apparent simplicity of their equipment. Captain Rodriguez, Sarah called to her flag captain as she boarded. How are we looking? All systems green, Commander, the weathered officer replied. Though I have to ask, are we really going to try what you outlined in your tactical brief? Sarah looked around at her crew, noting the mixture of excitement and concern in their faces. They had all heard the stories about human military history, about impossible victories against overwhelming odds, but they had also heard the dismissive comments from their alien allies. Captain, what's the first rule of human warfare? Rodriguez grinned. Never fight fair when fighting for survival. Exactly. And right now, we're fighting for the survival of this entire star system. Fair doesn't enter into it. She moved to the communication console and opened a channel to the other 11 human ships. The faces of her fellow captains appeared on the screen, all of them wearing expressions of grim determination. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began. In 48 hours, we're going to face an enemy that has never been defeated. Our allies expect us to follow their example and be destroyed in a conventional battle. I propose we give both the Void Swarm and our allies something completely different. What did you have in mind, Commander? Asked Captain Torres of the USS Constitution, the oldest ship in the small human fleet. We're going to fight like humans, Sarah said simply. Dirty, unpredictable, and absolutely without mercy. The galaxy is about to learn what humanity really brings to the table. As the human fleet prepared for departure, the alien vessels around them continued their own preparations. Advanced targeting systems were calibrated, energy shields were tested, and quantum weapons were charged. Everything followed established protocols that had been refined over thousands of years of galactic warfare. None of them noticed the humans loading what appeared to be primitive kinetic projectiles into their weapon bays, or the unusual modifications being made to their engines and navigation systems. After all, what could primitive humans possibly do that would matter in a battle of this magnitude? They were about to find out. The Kepler 442 system stretched before them like a three-dimensional chessboard, with planets, moons, and asteroid fields serving as potential cover and tactical positions. The combined coalition fleet had arranged itself in the classical defensive formation that had been taught in military academies across 7 star systems for generations. It was a formation that emphasized concentrated firepower, overlapping fields of fire, and maximum utilization of advanced defensive technologies. Admiral Zethka commanded the center formation from his flagship, the Valorian dreadnought times Eternal Glory *. Around him, the pride of galactic military engineering formed precise geometric patterns that looked impressive on tactical displays and had proven effective against conventional enemies. Energy shields shimmered like soap bubbles around each vessel. Quantum disruptors charged to full power, and targeting computers locked onto predetermined firing solutions. General Coraxus positioned his draconian heavy cruisers in a supporting formation, their plasma cannons ready to deliver devastating volleys of superheated matter. The Chitin swarm fighters buzzed around the larger vessels like angry insects, their pilots eager to demonstrate their species' aerial superiority. 20 kilometers away, almost forgotten, on the edge of sensor range, 12 human ships hung in space like afterthoughts. They maintained loose formation, if it could even be called that, with none of the precision or geometric perfection displayed by their allies. To the trained eye of any galactic military officer, they looked exactly like what they were supposed to be: primitive, disorganized, and irrelevant to the upcoming battle. Commander Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the USS Times Defiance *, studying the tactical display with the same intensity she had once applied to ancient military texts at the Naval Academy. But instead of seeing ship positions and weapons ranges, she saw something entirely different. She saw patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities that existed not in the enemy's formation, but in the coalition's own rigid adherence to doctrine. "Captain Rodriguez," she said quietly, "signal the fleet. Execute Pattern Omega." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Pattern Omega wasn't in any coalition tactical manual. It wasn't in any manual at all. Because Sarah had invented it 3 days ago, based on a battle fought in Earth's Pacific Ocean over 400 years earlier. "You heard the commander," Rodriguez announced to the bridge crew. "Pattern Omega. Let's show these aliens how humans really fight." The 12 human ships suddenly scattered like startled birds. To any observer, it looked like panic or complete breakdown of military discipline. The formations that had taken hours to establish dissolved in moments as each ship headed in a different direction at maximum acceleration. On the Times Eternal Glory *, Admiral Zethka watched the human ships disappear from his tactical display with a mixture of amusement and disgust. "Primitive cowards," he muttered to his bridge crew. "They're running before the battle even begins. Should we recall them?" his tactical officer asked. "Let them go," Zethka replied dismissively. "Better to fight without them than have them interfere with proper military operations." What the admiral didn't realize was that the human ships hadn't fled. They had simply stopped fighting like everyone else expected them to fight. The Times USS Constitution *, Captain Torres commanding, slipped behind the shadow of Kepler 442's largest moon, and began deploying what looked like simple metal spheres into the moon's orbital path. To any scanning system, they appeared to be nothing more than navigation buoys or communication relays, the kind of basic equipment that primitive civilizations used for simple space operations. The Times USS Relentless Times took position near an asteroid field and began launching what appeared to be mining equipment toward the larger rocks. Again, perfectly normal behavior for a species that still relied on physical resource extraction rather than advanced matter synthesis. The remaining 10 ships spread out across the system, each one apparently engaged in routine maintenance or supply operations that had nothing to do with military preparedness. They looked busy but harmless, like janitors cleaning up before the real work began. The Void Swarm arrived exactly on schedule. They emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their ships unlike anything in the galactic database. Black hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Geometries that hurt to look at directly, and energy signatures that made no sense according to established physics. There were hundreds of them, ranging from kilometer-long capital ships to fighter-sized craft that moved with impossible agility. "All ships, prepare to engage," Admiral Zethka commanded. his voice carrying across the Coalition fleet frequency. Show them the power of civilized warfare. The battle began exactly as every previous encounter with the Void Swarm had begun. The alien attackers swept forward in their characteristic formation, their weapons systems targeting the largest and most threatening ships first. Energy beams that could slice through quantum shields struck the Coalition fleet, while reality-warping torpedoes phased through conventional armor as if it didn't exist. The Coalition responded with everything they had. Quantum disruptors sent exotic particles racing across space. Plasma cannons fired superheated streams of matter, and the Chitin swarm fighters launched their coordinated assault patterns. For a few moments, it looked like the advanced technology of 7 civilizations might be enough. Then the Void Swarm adapted. Their ships shifted formation with fluid grace, countering each Coalition tactic almost before it was implemented. Energy shields that had never been penetrated crumpled like paper. Weapons that had never missed found themselves targeting empty space as enemy ships phased in and out of normal dimensions. Within minutes, the pride of galactic military engineering was being systematically dismantled. Impossible. General Caraxes snarled as his flagship shuddered under weapons fire that shouldn't have been able to penetrate his shields. They're countering tactics we've never used before. They're reading our intentions, Commander Vextai reported with logical precision, somehow predicting our movements before we make them. Admiral Zethka watched his tactical display with growing horror as ship after ship disappeared from the formation. The Times Eternal Glory Times herself had lost 2/3 of her weapon systems and was venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. Around him, the most advanced fleet ever assembled was being reduced to scrap metal with terrifying efficiency. All ships, fall back to defensive positions, he commanded, though he knew it was futile. The Void Swarm had seen this pattern before, had adapted to counter these exact tactics in 3 previous systems. They knew exactly how the Coalition would retreat, exactly how they would regroup, exactly how they would make their final stand. That's when the impossible happened. The Times USS Constitution *, appearing from behind Kepler 442's largest moon, opened fire with what looked like simple kinetic projectiles. Not exotic matter, not plasma bolts, not quantum torpedoes. Just chunks of metal accelerated to incredible velocities by chemical propulsion systems that belonged in a museum. The Void Swarm ships, their defensive systems calibrated to counter advanced energy weapons and reality-warping attacks, had no protocols for dealing with what amounted to very fast rocks. The first salvo punched through their hulls like bullets through paper, causing explosions that rippled across their formation. Before the enemy could adapt, the metal spheres that the Constitution had deployed earlier suddenly activated. They weren't navigation buoys at all, but kinetic mines that had been waiting in orbital trajectories calculated to intersect with the Void Swarm's predictable attack pattern. Dozens of enemy fighters simply ceased to exist as they flew into clouds of high-velocity shrapnel. "What the hell was that?" Admiral Zethka demanded. "The humans, sir," his tactical officer replied in shock. "They're using primitive kinetic weapons. That's impossible. Kinetic weapons can't penetrate advanced shields. They can if the shields aren't calibrated to stop them," Commander Vextai said with sudden understanding. "The Void Swarm's defenses are designed to counter our technology, but the human weapons are so primitive that they're essentially invisible to advanced defensive systems." The Times USS Relentless Times chose that moment to spring its own surprise. The mining equipment it had been deploying turned out to be a network of kinetic projectile launchers, hidden among the asteroids. Suddenly, the entire asteroid field became a weapons platform, launching a continuous stream of metal projectiles at velocities that would have been impossible to achieve from a ship-mounted weapon. The Void Swarm found themselves under attack from directions they hadn't anticipated, using weapons they hadn't encountered, following tactical patterns that violated every principle of civilized warfare. For the first time since their arrival, their perfect formations began to waver. "All human ships, this is Commander Chen." Sarah's voice cut across the Coalition frequency. "Execute Phase 2. Remember, they're expecting us to fight fair. Don't. Mine every 10. What happened next would be studied in military academies for centuries, though many would refuse to believe it actually occurred. The 12 human ships emerged from hiding positions throughout the system and began implementing tactics that no military manual had ever considered. The Times USS Defiance Times launched what appeared to be escape pods directly at an enemy capital ship. The Void Swarm, detecting life signs in the pods, held their fire to preserve whatever intelligence value the humans might have. The pods impacted against the enemy hull and immediately detonated, revealing themselves to be crude but effective nuclear devices operated by artificial intelligence rather than human crews. They're using kamikaze tactics, Admiral Zethka said in disbelief. They're sacrificing their own escape pods. Not sacrificing, General Caraxes corrected grimly. Those weren't real escape pods. The humans tricked the enemy into thinking they contained prisoners. The Times USS Intrepid Times began firing what looked like communication satellites toward the largest void swarm formation. When the satellites achieved optimal positioning, they revealed themselves to be improvised electromagnetic pulse generators that disabled enemy systems across a wide area. Ships that had been phasing in and out of normal space suddenly became solid targets for conventional weapons. Captain Torres of the Constitution had positioned his ancient vessel in what appeared to be a defenseless position, broadcasting fake distress signals that suggested critical system failures. When 3 Void Swarm fighters moved in to finish off the apparently crippled ship, they discovered too late that the Constitution's failures were completely fictitious. The old ship's weapons, hidden by false energy readings, destroyed all 3 attackers at point-blank range. This is madness, Admiral Zethka muttered as he watched the humans systematically violate every principle of honorable combat. They're fighting like criminals. No, Fleet Admiral Zenthos said quietly over the command frequency. They're fighting like humans. The tide of battle began to turn. Not because the human weapons were superior to the Coalition's advanced technology, but because the Void Swarm had never encountered an enemy that refused to follow established patterns. Their adaptive algorithms, perfect for countering sophisticated military doctrine, had no framework for dealing with tactics that were fundamentally chaotic. When the Times USS Yorktown Times began broadcasting human music at volumes that interfered with Void Swarm communications, the aliens tried to jam the signal, using standard electronic warfare protocols. But human music wasn't designed for military efficiency. Its chaotic structure, emotional content, and complete disregard for logical patterns proved impossible to counter using conventional methods. The Times USS Monitor Times took advantage of the confusion to implement what Captain Barnes called the Nelson Maneuver. Based on a naval battle from Earth's ancient history, she positioned her ship directly alongside an enemy vessel and began firing kinetic projectiles at point-blank range while simultaneously ramming the alien ship with her reinforced hull. They're trying to board us, the alien commander probably thought, right up until the Monitor's crude but effective explosives turned both ships into expanding clouds of debris. Sir, Admiral Zethka's tactical officer reported, the human attack patterns are completely unpredictable. Our computers can't generate countermeasures because they're not following any logical sequence. That's because they're not supposed to be logical. Sarah's voice came over the open frequency. We're supposed to be desperate, chaotic, and absolutely insane. And right now, that's exactly what this battle needs. The Times USS Washington Times proved her point by doing something that violated every principle of space combat. Instead of maintaining a safe distance from enemy vessels, Captain Kim ordered a direct collision course with a Void Swarm capital ship. At the last possible moment, she ejected her ship's entire cargo bay, which contained not supplies or equipment, but several tons of military-grade explosives programmed to detonate on impact. The explosion tore through the enemy ship's hull, while the Washington herself spun away from the collision, her crew cheering like pirates who had just successfully pulled off the most audacious raid in history. The human commander is right, Fleet Admiral Zenthos announced to the Coalition fleet. We've been fighting with honor while they've been fighting to win. All ships, support human operations. Follow their lead. Admiral, follow their lead? General Caraxes protested. They're not following any lead at all. They're making it up as they go along. Exactly, Xanthos replied. And it's working. The coalition fleet, inspired by human recklessness, or perhaps infected by human insanity, began to abandon their rigid formations and precise tactics. Valorian ships started ramming enemy vessels instead of engaging at respectful distances. Draconian cruisers began using their plasma cannons at point-blank range, accepting damage to their own shields in exchange for maximum destructive effect. The Cheetine swarm fighters, naturally chaotic by nature, took to the new tactics with enthusiasm. Instead of following predetermined attack patterns, they began swarming enemy ships like actual insects, accepting massive casualties in exchange for overwhelming their targets through sheer numbers and unpredictability. But it was the humans who continued to push the boundaries of military madness. The Times USS Saratoga Times had been playing dead for 30 minutes, drifting through space while broadcasting emergency signals and fake life support failures. When enemy ships approached to investigate, they discovered that the Saratoga's critically damaged hull was actually packed with kinetic projectile launchers that turned the apparently helpless vessel into a point-blank firing platform. "This is completely insane," Admiral Zethka said, though his tone had shifted from dismay to something approaching admiration. "They're fighting a space battle using tactics from their primitive surface wars. And it's working," his tactical officer pointed out. "The Void Swarm has lost 30% of their fleet. How is that possible?" Commander Vex Tai, monitoring the battle from his command ship, provided the logical analysis. "The Void Swarm's adaptive capabilities are designed to counter systematic, predictable tactics. But the humans aren't using tactics at all in any conventional sense. They're improvising constantly, making decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than predetermined strategies." "That's not tactics," General Coraxus protested. "That's chaos." "Yes," Sarah's voice cut in from the defiance. "And chaos is exactly what wins wars when everyone else is playing by the same rules." The USS Arizona chose that moment to demonstrate just how chaotic human warfare could become. Captain Rodriguez had loaded her ship's torpedo tubes, not with weapons, but with what appeared to be garbage, scraps of metal, broken equipment, and assorted debris. When fired at high velocity toward enemy formations, the garbage created a cloud of unpredictable projectiles that overwhelmed point defense systems designed to counter sophisticated guided missiles. The Void Swarm, faced with an enemy that refused to behave logically, began to make mistakes. Ships that had moved with perfect coordination started to hesitate, their adaptive algorithms struggling to process tactical information that made no mathematical sense. Formations that had been flawlessly maintained began to break down as individual commanders tried to counter human unpredictability with improvisation of their own. But improvisation was humanity's greatest strength, not theirs. The Times USS Lexington Times had been broadcasting false surrender signals while secretly charging her main weapon systems. When enemy ships moved in to accept the surrender, they found themselves facing not a defeated vessel, but a fully armed warship at minimum range. The resulting exchange destroyed the Lexington, but took 3 enemy capital ships with her. "They're sacrificing their own ships," Admiral Zethka observed. "Deliberately trading one vessel for multiple enemy kills. It's called acceptable losses," Sarah replied grimly. "Something we learned from fighting wars, where survival was more important than honor." The battle raged for 6 more hours, during which the humans continued to violate every convention of civilized warfare, while their alien allies slowly adapted to fighting like barbarians. The Void Swarm, masters of adapting to advanced tactics, found themselves increasingly unable to counter enemies who had no tactics at all beyond hit them with whatever works. When the last enemy ship finally fell to a combined barrage of quantum disruptors and kinetic projectiles, the Kepler 442 system fell silent except for the hum of damaged life support systems and the crackle of cooling weapon batteries. Of the original coalition fleet, nearly 70% had been destroyed or severely damaged. Of the 12 human ships, only 4 remained operational. But for the first time since the Void Swarm had emerged from extragalactic space, they had been not just stopped, but completely defeated. "Impossible," Admiral Zethko whispered, as he surveyed the aftermath. They weren't primitive, Fleet Admiral Zenthos said slowly. They were human. And apparently, there's a very big difference. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler 442, the emergency session of the Galactic Defense Council convened in the most secure facility in known space. The meeting chamber, built into the heart of an asteroid fortress at the edge of neutral territory, buzzed with tension as representatives from 47 different species gathered to discuss what everyone now referred to as the human problem. Commander Sarah Chen sat in the same chair she had occupied during that first briefing. But everything else had changed. The dismissive glances were gone, replaced by something far more complex. Fear, respect, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility filled the room like competing atmospheric pressures. The reports spread across the conference table told a story that most of the delegates were still struggling to accept. After Kepler 442, 3 more void swarm incursions had been detected. In each case, human tactical advisors had been requested. Human crews had been assigned to coalition vessels, and human chaos doctrine had been implemented. The results had been unprecedented success, with the previously unstoppable void swarm suffering defeat after defeat. But victory had come with consequences that no one had anticipated. Admiral Zethka, his crystalline features showing new stress fractures that hadn't been there before the battle, called the session to order. We are here to address what military historians are already calling the most significant tactical revolution in galactic history. The question before us is simple. What do we do about humanity? General Coraxus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The proud Draconian commander had lost his flagship at Kepler 442. Though he had survived by following human-style desperate tactics that had saved both his life and his honor. The humans have proven effective, he admitted grudgingly, but their methods are disturbing to established military doctrine. Disturbing? Commander Theklar, of the rigid hierarchy, spoke up, her metallic voice carrying obvious agitation. They've completely abandoned every principle of civilized warfare. Our own forces are beginning to question centuries of military tradition. Sarah remained silent, letting the debate swirl around her while she studied the faces of representatives who had once treated her as an amusing curiosity. Now they looked at her like she was a dangerous weapon that might explode at any moment. The tactical effectiveness cannot be disputed, announced Professor Vex Tai, who had spent the past months conducting detailed analysis of human combat methods. Human unpredictability creates a tactical advantage that our enemies cannot counter. However, the psychological effects on our own forces are becoming problematic. Fleet Admiral Zenthos activated a holographic display showing casualty reports from recent battles. Human-advised operations show 30% lower friendly losses and 60% higher enemy kill ratios compared to traditional coalition tactics. From a strategic perspective, we would be foolish to abandon methods that save lives and win wars. But at what cost? Demanded Ambassador Sithara of the Peaceful Union. Our junior officers are beginning to question why we follow rules of engagement when humans ignore them completely. Military academies are reporting requests to study human warfare instead of established doctrine. We're creating a generation that sees chaos as preferable to order. Sarah finally spoke, her voice cutting through the debate with quiet authority. If I may, what exactly is the nature of your complaint? That we're winning too effectively? 2. The question created an uncomfortable silence. Admiral Zethka's mandibles clicked slowly, a sign of deep thought. The complaint, Commander Chen, is that victory achieved through barbarism sets a dangerous precedent for galactic civilization. Barbarism, Sarah repeated slowly. Is that what you call saving the Kepler 442 system? Is that what you call stopping the void swarm from consuming 3 more star systems and trillions of lives? You're missing the point, General Coraxus interjected. Yes, your tactics work. But they work Because you refuse to acknowledge any limitations on acceptable behavior. You treat warfare as a contest where only victory matters, regardless of cost or method. Sarah stood, moving to the holographic display to call up tactical recordings from the recent battles. Let me show you something interesting. Computer, display comparative analysis of coalition versus human tactical decision trees. The hologram shifted to show branching patterns representing decision-making processes. The coalition patterns were elegant trees, with clear branches representing logical choice points and predetermined responses. The human patterns looked like tangled webs, with no clear structure or predictable outcomes. This is exactly the problem, Admiral Zethka said, gesturing at the chaotic human patterns. Your decision-making process has no structure, no logical progression, no adherence to established principles. Exactly, Sarah replied. And that's why it works. Look at the Void Swarm's adaptive responses to both patterns. She highlighted how the enemy's algorithms had successfully countered coalition tactics by predicting logical decision trees, but had failed completely when faced with human unpredictability. They can adapt to any systematic approach, because systematic approaches are inherently predictable. But they can't adapt to chaos, because chaos has no pattern to predict. But chaos cannot be taught, Professor Vextai pointed out logically. How do you train officers to abandon logic and embrace randomness? Sarah smiled grimly. You don't train them to abandon logic. You train them to think differently about what logic means in combat situations. She called up historical data from Earth's military academies. Human military education doesn't just teach tactics and strategy. It teaches improvisation, adaptation, and decision-making under impossible circumstances. We don't just prepare officers to follow plans. We prepare them to succeed when all plans fail. And how exactly do you teach that? Admiral Zethka asked skeptically. Through scenarios that have no predetermined solutions, Sarah explained. We put officers in impossible situations and force them to find ways to win anyway. We teach them that following rules is less important than achieving objectives. Commander Theklar's metallic features expressed obvious disapproval. That approach produces officers who cannot be trusted to follow orders or maintain discipline. No, Sarah corrected. It produces officers who understand that orders and discipline are tools to achieve victory, not ends in themselves. When following orders leads to defeat, good officers find another way to accomplish the mission. She highlighted specific examples from the recent battles. At Kepler 442, Captain Torres of the Constitution ignored direct orders to maintain formation and instead positioned his ship to exploit a tactical opportunity that hadn't existed when the orders were issued. If he had followed his orders, we would have lost the battle. And if every officer begins ignoring orders, we will have anarchy instead of military organization, General Coraxis pointed out. Sarah pulled up another display showing human command structure during the recent battles. Look at how human units actually functioned during combat. Yes, individual commanders made independent decisions, but they all understood the overall objective and worked toward it using whatever methods were most effective. That's not military discipline, Admiral Zethka observed. That's organized chaos. Yes, Sarah agreed. And organized chaos defeated the most advanced military threat the galaxy has ever faced. Fleet Admiral Zenthos had been silent through most of the debate, his massive form shifting thoughtfully in his water-filled environment suit. Finally, he spoke. Commander Chen, your methods have proven effective against the Void Swarm. But what about conflicts between galactic civilizations? Would human tactics work against opponents who could adapt to your unpredictability? Sarah considered the question carefully. Admiral, human tactics work because they're based on a fundamental understanding that every enemy is different and every situation is unique. We don't have one approach that we use against all opponents. We analyze the specific enemy, the specific circumstances, and the specific objectives, then we improvise solutions. But that requires officers capable of such improvisation, Professor Vextai pointed out. How do you propose to train non-human personnel in methods that appear to be culturally specific to your species? By changing how we think about military education, Sarah replied. Instead of teaching rigid doctrine, teach flexible principles. Instead of memorizing predetermined responses, teach analysis and adaptation. Instead of following established patterns, teach pattern recognition and pattern breaking. The debate continued for hours, with delegates expressing concerns about everything from military discipline to the philosophical implications of abandoning established principles of civilized warfare. But underlying every argument was a simple fact that no one could ignore. Human methods worked when nothing else did. I think, Admiral Zithka finally said, that we need to hear from someone who has actually commanded coalition forces using these new methods. He activated a communication link, and the holographic image of Admiral Korth Axe of the reformed coalition fleet appeared. The veteran commander had been leading mixed human-alien task forces in recent operations, implementing what military analysts were calling hybrid doctrine. Admiral Korth Axe, Admiral Zethka said formally, please share your assessment of human tactical integration with coalition forces. The holographic admiral studied the gathered delegates for a moment before responding. In 30 years of military service, I have never seen anything more effective or more terrifying than watching human officers teach my crew to fight dirty. Elaborate, General Caraxes demanded. Before human integration, my ship operated according to the Tactical Manual of Unified Fleet Operations, 3rd edition, Revision 7. We had predetermined responses for every conceivable situation, established firing solutions for every class of enemy vessel, and emergency procedures that had been refined over centuries. Korth Axe paused, his scaled features showing a mixture of admiration and unease. The humans threw all of that away on the first day. They analyzed our equipment, our crew capabilities, and our specific mission parameters, then designed completely new tactics that had never been attempted before. One, please. Are weak-hearted? And the results? Fleet Admiral Zenthos inquired. Complete success, Korth Axe admitted, but at the cost of everything my crew thought they knew about proper military procedure. We started the mission as a disciplined coalition vessel following established doctrine. We ended it as something entirely different. Different how? Admiral Zethka asked. We learned to think like humans, Korth Axe said simply. To see every situation as unique, every enemy as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a problem with a predetermined solution. My tactical officer now begins every engagement by asking, what do they expect us to do? And then doing something completely different. Sarah watched the delegates absorb this information, noting the mixture of fascination and concern on their alien features. Admiral Korth Axe, would you recommend human tactical integration to other coalition commanders? Without hesitation, the Admiral replied immediately, but with full understanding that it changes everything about how military operations are conducted. Officers trained in human methods cannot simply return to traditional doctrine. They've learned to think differently about warfare itself. And you see this as positive? Professor Vextai asked. Korth Axe was quiet for a long moment. I see it as necessary. The galaxy is changing, Professor. The threats we face are evolving beyond the capabilities of traditional military responses. Human methods may be chaotic and unpredictable, but they work when nothing else will. The communication ended, leaving the delegates to contemplate the implications. Finally, Ambassador Sithara, of the Peaceful Union, voiced what many were thinking. We are discussing the fundamental transformation of galactic military culture. The abandonment of principles that have maintained civilized warfare for thousands of years. We are discussing survival, Sarah corrected firmly. The Void Swarm nearly destroyed 4 star systems, using tactics specifically designed to counter civilized warfare. If we want to survive future threats, we need to be willing to evolve. But evolution should not mean abandoning civilization, Commander Theklar argued. It doesn't, Sarah replied. It means expanding our definition of what civilization can include. Human warfare may look chaotic to you, but it's based on principles that are just as valid as yours. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, accomplish the mission regardless of cost, and never give up as long as any possibility of victory remains. General Caraxes studied her with new respect. Those are principles I can understand, even if I disagree with your methods. Then perhaps, Fleet Admiral Zenthos suggested slowly, we should focus on integrating those principles rather than copying our methods exactly. Sarah nodded. Every species approaches problems differently. Humans fight chaotically because that's how our minds work, but other species might find different ways to achieve the same flexibility and adaptability. What are you proposing? Admiral Zethka asked. A new approach to military education, Sarah said, calling up a detailed proposal she had been working on for months. Mixed species training programs where human instructors teach improvisation and adaptation, while alien instructors teach their own species' tactical strengths. The goal isn't to make everyone fight like humans, but to make everyone capable of fighting outside their traditional patterns when necessary. Hybrid doctrine, Professor Vex Tai said thoughtfully. Interesting concept. Maintain species-specific advantages while developing cross-cultural tactical flexibility. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. The Void Swarm defeated us initially because all galactic militaries followed similar patterns. But if each species develops its own form of unpredictability based on its natural strengths, future enemies will face not just chaos, but multiple different types of chaos that can't be countered with a single adaptive strategy. The debate that followed was intense, but more productive than before. Instead of arguing about whether to abandon established doctrine, the delegates began discussing how to evolve it. Species-specific advantages were identified, cross-training opportunities were evaluated, and new command structures were proposed that would allow for tactical flexibility while maintaining strategic coordination. This will require years to implement, Admiral Zethka pointed out. Decades to fully integrate into existing military structures. Which is exactly why we need to start now, Sarah replied. The Void Swarm may be defeated for the moment, but they're not the only threat out there. The galaxy is full of enemies who have studied our traditional methods and developed counters for them. And you believe this new approach will be effective against unknown future threats? General Caraxes asked. I believe adaptability is always more effective than rigidity, Sarah answered. But, more importantly, I believe that learning to think differently about problems makes us better at solving any problem we might face. Fleet Admiral Zenthos bubbled thoughtfully in his environment suit. Commander Chen, you came to us months ago with a proposal that seemed insane. Now you're proposing to fundamentally change how the entire galaxy approaches military strategy. Yes, sir. Sarah replied simply. Tenel 19. Tenel 19 right, man. Tenel 19 ride. And you believe this will work? Sarah looked around the room at representatives of dozens of species, each of whom had their own traditions, advantages, and ways of thinking about warfare. Admiral, the human race spent thousands of years fighting each other before we developed space travel. We learned to win against enemies who used our own weapons, spoke our own language, and understood exactly how we thought. Your point? We learned that victory doesn't go to the side with the best weapons or the most advanced technology. It goes to the side that can think one step ahead of their opponent. And thinking one step ahead requires being able to think differently than your opponent expects. Even if that opponent is another galactic civilization using these same new methods? Admiral Zethka asked. Sarah smiled. Especially then, because if everyone is trying to be unpredictable, then the real advantage goes to whoever can be unpredictable about their unpredictability. The silence that followed was broken by what might have been laughter from several different species, though it was hard to tell with the translation software. You're talking about meta-tactical thinking, Professor Vex Tai said, with obvious fascination. Tactical decisions based not just on immediate circumstances, but on predictions about how opponents will try to counter tactical unpredictability. Now you're beginning to understand how humans really fight, Sarah said. It's not just about being chaotic. It's about being chaotic in ways that force your enemy to become predictable while trying to counter your chaos. The final vote was closer than Sarah had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. The Galactic Defense Coalition would implement hybrid tactical doctrine, with human advisors assigned to major military academies and mixed-species training programs established throughout Coalition space. But the real victory came 3 days later, when Admiral Zethka approached Sarah privately as she prepared to return to Earth. "Commander Chen," he said, his crystalline features reflecting the starlight from the observation deck's windows. "I owe you an apology. Sir, when you first proposed unconventional tactics, I dismissed you as primitive and naive. I was wrong. You weren't primitive. You were simply more advanced than the rest of us were ready to accept." Sarah studied the alien admiral's face, noting the genuine respect in his expression. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. There is one thing I still don't understand." Zethka continued. "How did you know that chaotic tactics would work when no one had ever tried them against an opponent like the Void Swarm?" Sarah looked out at the stars, thinking about the centuries of human warfare that had shaped her understanding of conflict. "Because, Admiral, chaos isn't really chaos if you understand its underlying principles. And the underlying principle of human warfare has always been simple. When you can't win by fighting better, win by fighting differently. And if the enemy adapts to fighting differently," Sarah smiled, "then you fight differently than your different fighting, until they can't predict what different means anymore." Admiral Zethka's mandibles clicked in. What Sarah had learned was profound amusement. "Commander, I think the galaxy is going to be a much more interesting place with humans in it." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I certainly hope so." As she watched the Coalition fleet disperse to their various home systems, each ship now carrying new ideas about what warfare could become, Sarah reflected on how far they had all come from that first dismissive briefing. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the biggest advantage came from being underestimated, and that sometimes the best way to win was to refuse to play by anyone's rules at all. The Void Swarm had been defeated not because humanity was stronger or more advanced, but because humanity had never learned to fight fair. And now, thanks to human influence, neither had anyone else. The galaxy would never be quite the same again.